Hey everyone, I hope you enjoy this. If you do, feel free to let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Wishing you a great time watching. Let me preface this by saying that I didn't think my life could turn into some kind of daytime soap opera. For context, my wife, let's call her Megan, and I had been married for 5 years. On the surface, we had it all. A quaint suburban home, a Labrador named Duke, and what I thought was a rock-solid relationship. Megan was the type of person everyone admired. She had this magnetic charm that could make strangers trust her instantly. At first, I thought I hit the jackpot marrying her. We'd met through mutual friends, and from day one, she seemed perfect. Too perfect, perhaps in hindsight. But over the past few months, something had shifted. It started small, late nights at yoga. A sudden increase in the amount of makeup she wore to errands. And most damning of all, her barely there affection. I tried brushing off the unease. She had a lot on her plate. Maybe work was stressing her out. Or maybe I was being paranoid. Still, there was one thing I couldn't ignore. My neighbor Brad. Brad was the walking definition of attractive. Tall, chiseled, a perpetual tan from doing shirtless yard work, and a smile that could make anyone forget their own name. He had moved in about 6 months ago, and from the moment he introduced himself, Megan couldn't stop bringing him up. "Oh, Brad helped me fix the faucet in the bathroom. Brad recommended this amazing wine. He's so cultured. Brad said Duke is the best trained dog he's ever seen." At first, I laughed it off. Megan was friendly by nature, and Brad was just being a good neighbor, or so I thought. Then came the gut punch moment. Last Friday, I came home early from work to surprise Megan with her favorite takeout. Instead of finding her on the couch binge-watching some Netflix series like she usually did on her day off, the house was empty. Duke greeted me, tail wagging, but the air in the living room felt wrong. There was an unfamiliar cologne lingering in the air. Brad's cologne, standing in my living room, holding the bag of takeout, and sniffing the faint whiff of cologne that definitely wasn't mine. I felt a pit form in my stomach. My first thought was that maybe Brad had stopped by. He was the neighborly type, after all. Maybe he came over to fix something. He was always fixing things for Megan. But why wouldn't she mention it? And why wasn't she home? Duke was oblivious to my growing unease, wagging his tail and nudging me for attention. I absent-mindedly scratched behind his ears, trying to rationalize my way out of the creeping suspicion. Maybe she went for a walk or to the store. Maybe anything else. I walked into the kitchen to put the food down when I noticed something strange. 2 wine glasses on the counter, one with a faint lipstick stain. Megan didn't drink wine when I wasn't around. She'd always said it was our thing. So, unless Duke had taken up day drinking, she'd shared it with someone. Brad. I shook my head, trying to get the thought out. There was no way, right? I trusted Megan. I trusted her with my heart, my home, my life. The evidence on the counter? Coincidence? I convinced myself I'd ask her about it casually, like it wasn't already eating me alive inside. But then I noticed her phone. Megan was usually glued to that thing, but she'd left it charging on the kitchen counter, screen down. For a second, I debated picking it up. My hands itched to unlock it, to find answers, or reassurance that I was just losing my mind. I didn't. At least, not yet. Instead, I paced the living room, replaying the past few weeks in my head. Megan had been distant, sure. She'd started dressing up more, had a sudden surge of me time, and seemed weirdly irritable when I asked innocent questions. But she always had an explanation, always something that made me feel like I was overthinking. And Brad? Maybe I was just jealous of him. Still, the pieces weren't adding up. Hours later, Megan strolled through the front door, carrying a small shopping bag from some boutique downtown. She looked surprised to see me. "Oh, you're home early," she said, her voice light, but her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Yeah," I replied, doing my best to keep my tone casual. "I thought I'd surprise you with some takeout. But when I got home, you weren't here." Her smile faltered for the briefest moment. So quick I might have missed it if I hadn't been studying her face like a detective. "I had a last-minute errand to run. You know, that boutique I love was having a sale," she said, holding up the bag. "Got a great deal on this cute sweater." She sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced that line on her way home. I didn't press her yet. Instead, I nodded and watched as she floated into the kitchen, her heels clicking on the tile. "Oh, you didn't have to get takeout," she said, spotting the bag on the counter. "We could have just cooked. Figured you'd like a break," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Did Brad stop by today?" Her head whipped around so fast, you'd think I'd accused her of a crime. "Brad?" she asked, her voice slightly higher than usual. "No, why? Just curious. I thought I smelled his cologne when I got home." Her laugh was a touch too loud. "What? No. That's ridiculous. Maybe you're smelling the air freshener I sprayed earlier." My gut told me she was lying, but instead of pressing further, I let it go for now. That night, as she slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The pit in my stomach had grown into a full-blown chasm, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was off, and Megan was hiding something. But what? The following morning, Megan was her usual cheerful self, almost too cheerful. She hummed as she cooked breakfast, wearing the new sweater she'd bought during her mysterious errand. I watched her from across the table, sipping my coffee, my mind racing. Was this guilt-fueled perkiness, or had I truly lost my mind? "Anything fun planned for the day?" she asked, sliding a plate of eggs and toast in front of me. "Not much," I said, forcing a smile. "Might spend some time in the garden." That seemed to appease her. Gardening had always been my thing, a stress reliever and a way to make our little slice of suburbia feel like paradise. Megan would occasionally help, but mostly she let me have it as my sanctuary. Lately, though, I've been avoiding it. After breakfast, I grabbed my gloves and tools, deciding that burying myself in dirt might help me bury my suspicions too. I walked out back, Duke bounding alongside me, his tail wagging in excitement. My garden looked the same as it always had, rows of flowers, neat beds of vegetables. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. There was a small patch of earth near the edge of the yard where the soil had started to sink. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight dip, but it hadn't been there before. Maybe I'd overwatered, or maybe the soil was just settling. I knelt down, running my fingers over the uneven ground. "Rodents," I muttered under my breath. I'd had trouble with them before, digging tunnels and wreaking havoc on my plants. I made a mental note to set up traps later, then pushed the thought aside and focused on pruning the rose bushes. Over the next few days, Megan's behavior continued to gnaw at me. She seemed on edge when I was around, glued to her phone, but careful not to let me see the screen. When I casually mentioned grabbing dinner with Brad and some other neighbors, she quickly shut the idea down. "I'm sure Brad's busy," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Plus, don't you want a night just for us?" I nodded, pretending to agree, but the alarm bells in my head grew louder. I wasn't imagining this. Something was definitely happening between her and Brad. That evening, after Megan went to bed, I finally gave in to temptation. Her phone was charging on the nightstand, and I stared at it like it was Pandora's box. My pulse raced as I picked it up, praying she hadn't changed her passcode. She hadn't. I swiped through her messages, feeling a mix of guilt and dread. Most of them were harmless, texts with her mom, group chats with friends, but then I found a thread with Brad. My chest tightened as I scrolled through it. At first, the messages seemed innocent enough. He'd sent her a picture of a new grill he was considering, and she'd responded with advice. But then, deeper into the thread, things took a turn. "Yesterday was amazing," one message read, followed by a winking emoji. "Just wait until next time," Megan had replied, adding a heart. I put the phone down, my hands shaking. I couldn't breathe. The words blurred together in my mind, and I felt like the walls were closing in. Yesterday. Amazing. Next time. Those words bounced around in my head as I sat there in the dark, staring at the woman I thought I knew that I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, the text replayed in my mind like a haunting melody I couldn't escape. Yesterday was amazing. What exactly had been amazing? Her errand? Her sweater shopping? Or was it something far worse? Megan stirred beside me, murmuring in her sleep. I stared at her, equal parts devastated and furious. The woman I loved, the woman I'd vowed to spend my life with, had lied to my face. I wanted to wake her up and confront her right then and there. But I didn't. No, this wasn't just about me anymore. If she and Brad had betrayed me, I needed proof. Undeniable proof. The next day, I went about my routine like everything was normal. Megan kissed me goodbye before heading out to work, her smile too wide, her touch too brief. I watched her drive away, my fists clenched at my sides. I spent most of the morning in the garden, trying to distract myself. But as I dug my hands into the soil, I couldn't help but notice the patch of sinking earth again. It had grown larger, the edges more defined. I crouched down, digging lightly with my trowel. The soil crumbled easily, almost like it had been disturbed recently. My mind wandered to rodents again, those pesky tunnel diggers that had been the bane of my gardening efforts for years. This time, though, it felt different, like the ground was hollow underneath. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my hands. Maybe I was overthinking this too, but something about that sinking patch felt as wrong as the pit in my stomach. By the time Megan came home that evening, I had managed to compose myself. She was chatty, throwing out tidbits about her day as she unpacked groceries. I nodded along, pretending to listen while my mind worked overtime. "Megan," I said casually, "you wouldn't believe the trouble I'm having in the garden." She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Oh, what's wrong?" "Rodents," I said, watching her closely. "The ground keeps sinking in this one spot. I think they're tunneling under the yard." Her face didn't change. No flinch, no twitch, but her hands hesitated ever so slightly as she put away a box of cereal. "That's annoying," she said, her tone neutral. "You'll figure it out, though." "You always do." I nodded, filing away her reaction. That night, after Megan had gone to bed, I did something I never thought I'd do. I bought a trail camera. The kind hunters used to track deer, with night vision and motion detection. If rodents, or anything else, were disturbing the ground in my garden, I wanted to catch them in the act. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about the truth. For the next 2 days, I played the part of the oblivious husband. I laughed at Megan's jokes, cooked dinner, and even cuddled on the couch to watch one of her favorite shows. But the whole time, my thoughts were with that camera, hidden near the sinking patch of earth in my garden. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. Early one morning, while Megan was still asleep, I slipped outside and retrieved the camera. My hands trembled as I connected it to my laptop, pulling up the footage. At first, it was just hours of nothing, an empty yard bathed in eerie green light. But then, in the dead of night, the camera caught movement. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. There, clear as day, was Brad, my neighbor, my wife's helpful friend. He was crouched near the sinking patch of earth, shovel in hand, working silently in the dark. My stomach turned as I watched him dig, his movements methodical, almost practiced. I played the clip over and over, each time feeling a little more like the floor beneath me was falling away. Why was he digging in my yard? How had I not noticed before? The worst part was that I didn't know what was more infuriating, the fact that he'd trespassed, or the sinking feeling in my gut that this was somehow tied to Megan. But I wasn't ready to confront her, or him yet. Not until I had the full picture. As I sat in my kitchen, staring blankly out the window at the garden, my mind wandered to how Megan and I had ended up here. It wasn't always like this. Once upon a time, she and I had been inseparable. We'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue 7 years ago. Megan had been sitting by herself, struggling to open a stubborn bottle of lemonade. I'd walked over, offered to help, and the rest was history. We clicked instantly. Her wit and charm balanced out my quieter, more practical nature. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony, surrounded by friends and family. Everything about our life seemed perfect back then. She'd laugh at my dumb jokes, and I'd stay up late listening to her dreams about starting her own business. I had my quirks too, my obsessive love for gardening being one of them. Megan used to joke that I cared more about my roses than her. It wasn't true, of course, but I'll admit, my garden became my escape from the stress of life. Somewhere along the line, though, the cracks started forming. Megan began working longer hours, while I buried myself deeper into my hobbies. We stopped laughing as much. The occasional bickering turned into full-blown arguments. But I thought we'd weather it, like we always did. Now, staring at Brad's grainy figure on my laptop screen, I wondered if I'd been wrong. That evening, Megan and I had dinner together. She was in high spirits, chatting about some projects she was working on at the office. I nodded along, but my mind was elsewhere. "How's Brad?" I asked suddenly, interrupting her mid-sentence. She blinked, caught off guard. "Brad? Oh, I don't know. I haven't talked to him in a while." Her tone was casual, but I didn't miss the way her fork paused briefly over her plate. She quickly recovered, scooping up a bite of pasta and smiling at me. "You seemed pretty friendly last time we saw him," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "He's a helpful guy, huh?" Megan gave a short laugh. "I guess. Why do you bring him up so much lately?" "Just curious," I said with a shrug, masking my growing frustration. After dinner, I excused myself to check on the garden, though my real purpose was to investigate the sinking patch further. With a flashlight in hand, I crouched down and started digging. The soil was loose, almost too loose for natural causes. About 6 inches down, my trowel hit something solid. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. Carefully, I brushed the dirt away, revealing a length of wood. Part of a support beam, maybe? But why would there be a beam buried under my garden? I dug further, my hands trembling. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a random patch of sinking soil. It was the entrance to something. My heart raced as I kept digging, uncovering more of the beam. The soil fell away in clumps, revealing what looked like the edge of a wooden frame. A tunnel. Brad had been digging a tunnel under my garden. But why? I grabbed my phone and snapped a few pictures before covering the spot back up, making it look undisturbed. If Brad or Megan came by, I didn't want them to know I'd found anything. That night, I lay in bed, pretending to sleep while my mind raced with possibilities. A tunnel meant planning, effort, secrecy. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing. Brad had a reason for digging, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Megan was tied to it. The next morning, I called out of work. Megan kissed me on the cheek as she left, oblivious to the storm brewing in my head. "Have a good day," she said, her smile bright but hollow. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed my gloves, flashlight, and a small hand shovel. It was time to see where that tunnel led. I worked quickly, uncovering the entrance and sliding inside. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of earth. The walls were surprisingly well supported, braced with wooden beams that looked like they'd been salvaged from an old shed or construction site. I crouched as I moved forward, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The tunnel wasn't long, maybe 30 or 40 feet, but it felt endless. My breath echoed in the confined space, each step bringing me closer to what exactly? And then I saw it, a crude wooden ladder leading up to a trapdoor. My chest tightened. Based on the direction, this had to lead straight to Brad's basement. I climbed up, pushing the trapdoor open a crack. The smell of sawdust and faint cologne wafted through. I could hear faint voices, Megan's laugh among them. My jaw tightened. I wanted to burst through the door, catch them red-handed, but I held back. Not yet. I eased the trapdoor shut and climbed back down, my mind whirling. Back at home, I cleaned up and stared at the camera footage again. Watching Brad dig in my yard was infuriating, but hearing Megan's laugh just now solidified what I'd been dreading. Every late-night errand, every yoga class, every cheerful deflection, she'd been lying to me. Brad wasn't just a neighbor. He was something more. The ground wasn't the only thing that had been sinking lately. By the time Megan came home that evening, I'd managed to bury my anger beneath a mask of normalcy. She walked in with her usual cheerful energy, carrying a shopping bag from yet another boutique. "Hey, hon," she chirped, setting the bag down. "I picked up something for dinner. Thought we could have a quiet night in." "Sounds good," I said, forcing a smile. "How was your day?" "Oh, the usual grind," she replied breezily, her back turned as she unpacked groceries. I couldn't tell if she was lying or if the guilt was finally eating at her. As the evening wore on, I studied her. She was so at ease, as if nothing was wrong. It made my stomach churn. Part of me wanted to confront her then and there, but another part, the colder, calculating part, told me to wait. I needed her to bury herself in her lies. The next day, I decided to test the waters. I walked over to Brad's house under the pretense of borrowing a tool. When he answered the door, he was as smug as ever, wearing his trademark too bright smile. "Hey man," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What's up? Just need to borrow a wrench." I said, keeping my tone neutral. You got one? Yeah, give me a sec. He disappeared inside, leaving the door open. I stepped into the entryway, my eyes scanning the space. Brad's house was as annoyingly perfect as he was, immaculate, stylish, and reeking of expensive cologne. As he rummaged through a toolbox, I glanced toward the basement door. Nice place as always, I said, keeping my tone light. What's that smell? Air freshener. Brad grinned as he handed me the wrench. No, just some cologne I picked up. The ladies love it. I clenched the wrench tighter, biting back a retort. Thanks, I said curtly, turning to leave. As I walked back to my house, my mind churned with rage and suspicion. His cologne, Megan's lingering scent after her errands. The pieces were falling into place, and I hated the picture they painted. That evening, I pretended everything was fine, even as the tension in my chest built. Megan sat across from me at dinner, scrolling through her phone and laughing at some meme she'd found. Anything interesting? I asked, my voice casual. She glanced up, her smile faltering slightly. Just some work stuff. Nothing exciting. I nodded, chewing my food slowly. Inside, I was seething. Late that night, after Megan had gone to bed, I decided to take action. I slipped out of the house, flashlight in hand, and made my way back to the tunnel. I had to see the full extent of this thing. I crawled through the dirt once more, my anger fueling me as I reached the ladder and climbed up. This time I didn't just peek through the trapdoor. I pushed it open. The trapdoor creaked softly as I eased it open, revealing the faint glow of a basement light. My heart raced as I climbed up, careful not to make a sound. The basement was surprisingly organized. Shelves lined with tools, cleaning supplies, and boxes labeled with Brad's neat handwriting. But it wasn't the basement itself that caught my attention. It was the unmistakable sound of laughter drifting down from the floor above. Megan's laughter. I froze, gripping the edge of the trapdoor. My pulse thundered in my ears. There was no mistaking it now. She was here. I considered my options, 1,000 scenarios flashing through my mind. Should I storm upstairs and confront them? Call the police? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I couldn't let this slide. After what felt like an eternity, the laughter stopped. Footsteps moved overhead, followed by the muffled sound of a door closing. I waited until the house fell silent before carefully climbing all the way into the basement. As I stood there, trying to make sense of everything, my eyes landed on a small table in the corner. On it were 2 wine glasses and an open bottle of red. My jaw tightened as I walked over, picking up one of the glasses. A faint lipstick stain on the rim confirmed what I already knew. Megan had been here, and she hadn't been hiding it. Before I left, I noticed something else. A set of muddy footprints leading from the trapdoor to the basement stairs. They weren't fresh, but they were clear enough to trace. The anger boiling inside me was almost too much to contain as I descended back into the tunnel and returned to my yard. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with Duke curled up at my feet, my mind replaying every suspicious moment from the past few months. The late nights, the evasive answers, the sinking patch of earth in my garden. It all pointed to one thing. Megan and Brad had been using that tunnel to carry on their affair, and they thought I wouldn't notice. But now I knew. The next morning, I went through the motions of my routine, pretending everything was fine. Megan kissed me goodbye as usual, none the wiser that I was on the verge of exploding. As soon as she left, I picked up the phone and called the one person who could help me handle this, my buddy Tim. Tim wasn't just a friend. He was a contractor who knew his way around demolition equipment. Hey, Tim, I said, forcing a casual tone. You free this weekend? I've got a project I need some help with. Tim arrived Saturday morning with his truck loaded up with tools, equipment, and, most importantly, a bag of heavy-duty explosives. I told him I was dealing with a serious rodent problem in my garden, one that required drastic measures. You weren't kidding, Tim said, eyeing the sinking patch of earth. Looks like you've got a real mess under there. What are we talking? Gophers? Groundhogs? Something like that, I muttered, avoiding his gaze. He shrugged, pulling out a set of small sticks of dynamite. Well, this'll take care of it. You sure about this, though? It's not every day someone wants to blow up their yard. Oh, I'm sure, I said, my jaw tightening. Tim didn't press further. He wasn't the type to question a man's motives. By the afternoon, we had everything set up. The dynamite was buried deep in the tunnel entrance, with the charges set to collapse the whole thing. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept wandering to Megan. She'd been acting strange all morning, more nervous than usual. "Everything okay?" I'd asked over breakfast. She'd forced a smile, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped her coffee. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" I didn't respond. With the charges in place, Tim handed me the detonator. "Just press the button when you're ready," he said, stepping back. I nodded, gripping the device tightly. My heart raced as I stared at the garden, imagining the destruction waiting to happen beneath the surface. But as I hesitated, a noise stopped me cold. "Help! Somebody help!" It was coming from the tunnel. Tim looked at me, confused. "Did you hear that?" I dropped the detonator and sprinted to the garden, my pulse hammering in my ears. I crouched by the tunnel entrance, my breath catching in my throat. "Help!" the voice called again, weaker this time. I shone my flashlight into the opening, and there he was, Brad. His face was streaked with dirt, his arms flailing as he tried to crawl toward me. "What the—" Tim started, but I cut him off. "Stay back!" I snapped, my voice shaking. Brad looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror. "Please! I'm stuck. You have to help me." I didn't move. My anger burned hotter than my instinct to help. This was the man who dug a tunnel to my house, who'd betrayed me with my wife, and now he was trapped in his own mess. "Why the hell should I help you?" I growled, but Brad's voice cracked as he begged, his arms scrambling against the loose dirt. "Please, man, I can't get out. I'll die in here." I stood at the edge of the tunnel, my flashlight casting an unforgiving beam on his panicked face. The sheer irony of it all wasn't lost on me. The same tunnel he'd used to crawl into my life, my marriage, was now threatening to bury him alive. Tim hovered a few feet behind me, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on here, man?" he asked, glancing between me and Brad. I ignored him, my focus locked on Brad. "How long?" I asked coldly. Brad's face contorted in confusion. "What? How long have you been screwing my wife?" His silence was answer enough. He froze, his eyes darting between mine and the flashlight, like a cornered animal. "You owe me that much," I continued, my voice trembling with rage. "So, answer me. How long?" "A few months," he finally croaked. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Don't you dare say you didn't mean for it to happen," I snapped, cutting him off. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You dug this tunnel, you lied to my face, and you thought I'd never find out." Tim took a cautious step forward, still trying to piece together what was happening. Whoa, hold on. This guy dug a tunnel under your yard? And he's been—" "Yes," I said through gritted teeth, not looking away from Brad. Tim let out a low whistle, rubbing the back of his neck. "Man, that's some next-level psycho behavior. What do you want to do?" Brad whimpered, his voice shaky. "Please, I'll explain everything. Just get me out of here first." I stared at him, my hand itching to grab the detonator again. But then a thought crossed my mind. As satisfying as it would be to leave him there, blowing him up wasn't the solution. No, I wanted everyone to see what kind of man he really was, what kind of man Megan had chosen over me. Reluctantly, I grabbed a rope from the shed and tossed it down to him. "Climb," I barked. Brad scrambled to grab the rope, his hands slipping on the dirt-covered fibers. Tim helped me anchor the other end as Brad slowly hoisted himself out of the tunnel. When he finally emerged, he collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. "You're not stepping foot on my property again," I growled, towering over him. "And don't think for a second that this is over. You're going to explain yourself, to me and to Megan." Brad didn't respond, his face pale and smeared with dirt. "Get out of here," I snapped. "Now!" He didn't need to be told twice. He staggered to his feet and stumbled back toward his house, glancing over his shoulder like he expected me to chase him. Once he was gone, Tim let out a long breath. "I don't even know what to say. You want to fill me in?" "Later," I muttered, my mind already racing. I wasn't done yet. Not with Brad, and certainly not with Megan. That'd be why the time I walked back into the house, I was a live wire of emotions, anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming need for answers. Duke padded over to me, sensing something was wrong, but even his usual comfort wasn't enough to calm me. Megan came home an hour later, carrying groceries and humming to herself like everything was fine. When she saw me standing in the living room, arms crossed, her smile faltered. "Hey," she said, setting the bags down. "You're home early. Everything okay? Why don't you tell me?" I asked, my voice cold. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Or at least, she played it well. "What's going on?" I didn't reply. Instead, I grabbed the laptop from the coffee table and opened the footage from the trail camera. The screen lit up with the image of Brad, shovel in hand, digging under my garden. Megan froze. Her face went pale as her eyes darted from the screen to me. What is this?" "You tell me," I said, my tone sharp. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your buddy Brad has been a little too involved in our lives." Her mouth opened and closed, searching for words. "I don't know what this is. Maybe he was fixing something?" I laughed bitterly. "Fixing something? You think I'm that stupid?" She took a step back, her hands trembling. "I don't know what you want me to say." "Try the truth for once," I snapped. "How long, Megan? How long has this been going on?" She crumbled then, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed, clutching the edge of the couch for support. "It's just we were lonely. You were always at work, and I felt invisible. Brad was there, and it just happened." "You mean you made it happen?" I corrected. "You let him into our lives, our marriage. You built this lie, Megan. And for what? Because you were bored? Lonely?" She didn't respond, her sobs filling the room. I paced the room, the rage boiling over. In the tunnel? What was the plan there? Sneaking him in and out while I was at work so the cameras wouldn't catch him? That's some next-level scheming, Megan. Her head shot up, eyes wide with shock. "You found the tunnel?" "Of course I did. And I found Brad stuck in it today." "You want to explain that?" She collapsed onto the couch, covering her face with her hands. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was just easier. We didn't want to risk anyone seeing us." Her words were like knives, cutting deeper with each syllable. "So, you thought it would be easier to dig a tunnel under my garden? Did you think I'd never notice?" "I didn't think you'd care," she shouted suddenly, her voice filled with desperation. "You haven't cared about us in years. All you do is work, and then you come home and bury yourself in that stupid garden." Her words hit me like a slap. "So, this is my fault now? I drove you to cheat on me with a neighbor?" "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm not saying that. I don't know how we got here." I shook my head, disgusted. "Well, let me make it clear where we're going from here. I'm done. This marriage is done. And you can take your excuses and your lies and go explain them to Brad, because I want nothing to do with either of you anymore." Her sobs turned into wails as I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, slamming it behind me. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house a second longer. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, my thoughts racing in circles. Every moment I'd shared with Megan now felt like a cruel joke. Her laughter, her touches, her promises, they were all poisoned by the knowledge of what she'd been doing behind my back. Eventually, I found myself parked in a lot near the local diner. It was quiet, almost empty, the perfect place to sit and try to untangle the mess in my head. As I stared out the windshield, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, Megan. I let it ring until it stopped, only for it to buzz again seconds later. This time it was a text. "We need to talk. Please come home." I turned the phone face down on the dashboard. There was nothing left to say. When I finally returned home, the house was eerily silent. Megan was sitting on the couch, her face pale and blotchy from crying. She looked up as I entered, her eyes pleading. "Can we just talk?" she asked softly. "Talk?" I echoed, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Sure. Why don't you tell me why I shouldn't file for divorce right now?" She flinched, but her gaze didn't waver. "Because I still love you," she said, her voice trembling. "Love?" I spat the word like it was venom. "You call this love? Sneaking around with Brad, digging tunnels under my garden? That's your idea of love?" "I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "A terrible mistake. But I want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Her desperation would have moved me once. But now, it only fueled my anger. You had your chance, Megan. And you didn't just break my trust, you annihilated it. There's no fixing this. Before she could respond, a knock at the door startled both of us. I froze, the timing almost too perfect. Megan stood, her movements hesitant. I'll get it, she said quietly. I watched as she opened the door, and my blood boiled when I saw who was standing there. Brad, what the hell are you doing here? I demanded, stepping forward. Brad raised his hands defensively, his face still smeared with dirt from the tunnel. I wanted to talk. You've got some nerve showing up here. I growled, my fists clenching. Megan stepped between us, her voice shaking. Please, both of you, stop. This isn't helping. I ignored her, my focus locked on Brad. Get off my property before I call the cops. You're lucky I didn't leave you to rot in that tunnel. Brad's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As soon as the door closed, I turned back to Megan. That's it. I'm done. What are you saying? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm filing for divorce, I said firmly. And I'll make sure everyone knows what you and Brad did. Her sobs filled the room as I grabbed a duffel bag and started packing. I wasn't sure where I'd go, but anywhere was better than here. That I didn't look back as I walked out the door, duffel bag slung over my shoulder and Duke trotting at my side. The night was cold and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos inside my chest. I drove to a motel a few towns over, needing space to think. As I settled into the bland, lifeless room, my phone buzzed incessantly. Megan again. I silenced it, tossing the phone onto the nightstand. This was the end of the line. There was no salvaging what she'd done. The next morning, I woke to another flood of messages and missed calls, but this time, it wasn't just Megan. My buddy Tim had called twice. There was also a voicemail from him. Curious, I played the message. Hey man, it's Tim. I've been thinking about what went down yesterday, and something's not sitting right with me. That guy, Brad, he seems scared of more than just you. I checked out the gear we left in the yard, and I think you should come back. There's more going on here. Call me. My stomach sank. What else could there possibly be? I drove back to the house, my thoughts racing. Tim was already waiting for me in the driveway, pacing nervously. What's going on? I asked, stepping out of the car. Tim motioned for me to follow him. You need to see this. We walked to the garden, where the remnants of our setup from the day before remained. The tunnel entrance was still exposed, but now something else caught my eye. Just beyond the dirt pile, hidden in the tall grass, was a small wooden chest. What's that? I asked. Found it when I was cleaning up, Tim said. Figured it might explain why your neighbor went full-on G.I. Joe under your yard. I crouched down and opened the chest. Inside were several thick envelopes, each stuffed with cash. Beneath the money was a folder labeled with Megan's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first page was a crude blueprint of the tunnel, complete with notes about its construction. The second page, though, was the real gut punch. It was a timeline, dates, and details of every time Brad had used the tunnel to sneak into my house. And Megan's signature was at the bottom of every page. I slammed the folder shut, my chest heaving with rage. Tim stood a few feet away, clearly uncomfortable. What the hell is this? I muttered, more to myself than to him. It's not just an affair, Tim said quietly. They were stealing from you. As the realization hit me, everything started to make sense. Megan's sudden shopping sprees, the wine nights, even the unexplained deposits in her personal account. She and Brad hadn't just been cheating. They'd been siphoning money from me, laundering it through some convoluted scheme that involved cash stashed in a tunnel under my own yard. I stood there, gripping the chest, my vision swimming with fury. This isn't just betrayal, I said through gritted teeth. This is theft. Fraud. They thought they could destroy me. Tim nodded solemnly. What do you want to do? I looked down at the chest, my mind already made up. I'm calling the cops. Calling the police felt like the first real step in reclaiming control. As I dialed, my hands still shook with anger, but there was a strange sense of clarity now. Megan and Brad had crossed a line far beyond betrayal. This wasn't just about my marriage anymore. It was about everything they had stolen from me, emotionally and materially. When the police arrived, I laid everything out for them. The tunnel, the money, the folder full of Megan's incriminating notes. Tim backed me up, explaining how he'd discovered the chest and what we'd pieced together. The lead officer listened carefully, his expression growing darker with each passing detail. "This is serious," he said, flipping through the folder. "We'll need statements from both you and your wife. And from this Brad." "Oh, you'll find him," I said, a bitter edge in my voice. The officers cordoned off the yard and began documenting everything. Megan returned home midway through the chaos, her face blanching as she saw the squad cars parked in the driveway. "What's going on?" she stammered, stepping out of her car. I didn't answer. Instead, I nodded toward the lead officer, who approached her with a notebook in hand. "Megan," he said, his tone professional but firm, "we need to ask you some questions about a tunnel discovered on this property." Her eyes widened, darting to me, then to the officers combing through the garden. "A tunnel? I don't know what you're talking about." "Cut the act, Megan," I said, stepping forward. "We found the chest, the money, the folder, your notes." Her face crumpled, and she shook her head frantically. "It's not what you think. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Oh, so you accidentally dug a tunnel and laundered money?" I snapped. "Spare me." Brad arrived shortly after, clearly having been dragged out of whatever hiding hole he'd crawled into. His face was pale, his shirt streaked with dirt, and his usual smugness was nowhere to be seen. As the officers began questioning both him and Megan, I stood back, arms crossed, watching them squirm. They threw accusations at each other, each trying to shift the blame. "It was her idea," Brad yelled. "She said it'd be easy to move the money without him noticing." "That's a lie," Megan shot back, her voice cracking. "He was the one who came up with the tunnel. I didn't know how to stop it." Their pathetic attempts to save themselves only solidified my resolve. The officers eventually cuffed Brad and led him to one of the squad cars. Megan wasn't arrested on the spot, but they informed her that she would likely face charges once the investigation was complete. As she stood there, tears streaming down her face, she turned to me. "Please, I can fix this. I'll make it right." "You've done enough," I said coldly. "You made your choices, Megan. Now you'll live with the consequences." By the time the officers left, my yard looked like a crime scene. Tape everywhere, the tunnel entrance now a gaping hole, and the chest of money tagged as evidence. Tim walked over, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, man. It's over now." I nodded, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. "Yeah, it's over." The days that followed felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's life. Megan moved out, taking only what the police allowed her to touch. I didn't say a word as she packed. There was nothing left to say. She tried one last time before leaving, standing in the doorway with tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I loved you, I really did. I just—" "Save it," I interrupted, my voice colder than I'd ever thought it could be. "Whatever love you had for me died the moment you invited him into our lives." Her lips trembled, but she nodded and left without another word. Brad, on the other hand, faced immediate repercussions. The police uncovered enough evidence to charge him with multiple counts of trespassing, theft, and conspiracy. His smug charm couldn't save him now. Seeing him led away in cuffs was a small comfort, but it didn't undo the damage he'd caused. As for Megan, the financial trail she'd left behind tied her to the scheme as well. She wasn't arrested yet, but her day in court was coming. The officers assured me they'd recover as much of the stolen money as possible, but that wasn't my priority anymore. In the weeks that followed, I started the painful process of picking up the pieces. The house, once a place of warmth and love, now felt like a hollow shell. I decided to sell it. The memories were too heavy to carry. Tim helped me fill in the tunnel and repair the garden. As we worked, he asked, "What's next for you?" I paused, looking at the bare patch of earth where the tunnel had been. "Starting over," I said, "somewhere far from here." Selling the house and cutting ties with the neighborhood felt like shedding a second skin. I bought a small cabin in the countryside, miles away from anyone who knew my story. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Duke and I settled in quickly. The solitude was refreshing, and the endless stretches of land became my new sanctuary. I planted a fresh garden, nothing fancy, just some vegetables and wildflowers. Each seed I sowed felt like a step toward healing. One night, as I sat on the porch with Duke by my side, I reflected on everything I'd lost and gained. Megan's betrayal had shattered me, but it also forced me to reevaluate what mattered most. Trust, honesty, and respect, things I'd taken for granted in our marriage, were now non-negotiable. I wouldn't let anger or bitterness define me. Instead, I chose to move forward, knowing that I'd learned from the pain. If there's one piece of advice I'd give to anyone reading this, it's this: trust your instincts. If something feels off, don't ignore it. But most importantly, know your worth. Don't settle for someone who makes you question your value or your sanity. Life after betrayal isn't easy, but it's possible. You can grow from it. I'm proof of that.